Hello, welcome back to some more reveals for Hearthstone Into the Emerald Dream. Today we have Hunter and Rogue cards to deal with. Just as a reminder before we get going, I mentioned this in the previous reveal, there is going to be a lowering of the power level of the game, which means that some of these cards where it's like, this card probably wouldn't see play, maybe now will see play depending on what patches happen going forwards. Until we see that patch, it's actually quite hard to tell what the power level of Hearthstone will be when this set comes out, but I'm just going to keep going based on, currently in Hearthstone, this probably wouldn't see play, but bear in mind that if the power level is low enough, maybe some of these cards that I say are a bit below what I'd expect, maybe are fine nowadays. Anyway, let's start with Hunter. Hunter, we've seen a few of the cards, and it's one of the imbue classes, and we've seen the button already. They have Gauldron, they have Grace of the Great Wolf, lol, Umbra Claw, and Blessing of the Wolf is their imbuing power, which is give a random beast in your hand +1 attack, and it costs 1 less. Gauldron has Rush and Beast deal double damage, only friendly beasts though. Umbra Claw is one of your imbuers, and then Grace of the Great Wolf is a card that you won't put in your deck because it is, not even arena worthy. Obviously, there is going to be a beast package, right? So let's get down to business. Actually, before we get down to business, I just want to let you know right now that there are beast packages in Hunter right now as the sets rotate out. However, none of them are really seeing play right now. The big Hunter decks out there are Secret Hunter, Discover Hunter, Grunter Hunter, and Zerg Hunter. This is just pulled from HS Replay at low level, so this isn't actually representative of the highest level, I'll just let you know, but these are 4 of the more popular decks at the very least. And none of them really run Beast. You'd have to go down to the Spell Token Hunter deck, and even then, that's not really a full Beast package, right, in the way that some of these cards want, especially your Imbue button, because you want the Beast in your hand, whereas in that deck you play spells that summon Beasts. However, there is going to be a bit of a vacuum in Hunter, a power vacuum, so to speak, because I think Secret Hunter will be significantly weaker going forward because it's losing some of the cards from Titans, which were very good secret cards. Grunter Hunter will not be viable because the card that makes it viable is rotating out. This leaves Discover Hunter and Zerg Hunter for Beast Hunter to compete with, or the Imbue Hunter. Now, I will say, though, you have to be, very strong Imbue Hunter if you are going to compete. Why? Well, both Zerg Hunter and Discover Hunter both have cards in the deck that want to change your button into something else. And obviously, if you're playing an Imbue deck, you will not want to change your button by using a hero card or Exarch Nael, for example, that replaces your hero power. So, Imbue Hunter, to see any play, is going to have to be above Discover Hunter and Zerg Hunter. Now, we know Zerg Hunter is going to get a nerf going forwards. I don't know if Discover Hunter will do, but Discover Hunter is a pretty strong value-filled deck. And from what we've seen of a lot of the cards right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of aggressive cards being printed right now. I don't know if the Hearthstone team have gone fine. If you don't like getting killed on turn 5, then no one can kill anyone by turn 10. Because it seems like a very slow meta that is, or a slow set from what we've seen so far. And the slower and slower the game gets, the more and more that greed gets rewarded. And there's not many better greed cards than Exarch Nael, so I'm just going to put this from the outset that I think the Imbue Hunter deck has to be especially good if it's going to see any play. Now, just as a reminder again, there are some beasts and beast synergies in Hunter right now. There's Painted Canvassaur, which did see a bit of play in the Spell Token Beast deck, because this buffs beasts on the board. Obviously, if you're playing a Beast Hunter deck, you're probably going to have beasts in your deck that could get buffed on the board. Jungle Gym is out there as well, which again really wants you to swarm beasts onto the board, but gives you a reward again for one beast in your deck. Mystery Egg can cheat out beasts from... I say it can cheat out. It can cheat out beasts from your deck into your hand and reduce their cost, which actually is somewhat fitting with the theme of the button Blessing of the Wolf, which also reduces the cost of your beast. So maybe you do a Breakfast Hunter deck, which has not really seen some play since Mystery Egg got nerfed. That being said, there is actually still a Death Rattle Hunter synergy because Terrascale Stalker is rotating into the core set, so you could still do some sort of Death Rattle Hunter deck. Maybe you pop the Mystery Egg with Terrascale Stalker, draw a beast from your deck, get a 3 cost reduction, and then on your imbued button, you push it again, hopefully hit that egg thing, and you cheat out a King Crush type thing, or King Plush, sorry, for 4 mana or something like that. That's pretty spooky, right? Finally, there is something like Master's Call as well in the core set. I say finally, there are a few other things, but Master's Call's in the core set. The problem with Master's Call, though, in this Imbue deck, and actually true of a lot of the other cards that I'm not going to mention that say something like Draw a Beast, Y happens, If you're doing Imbue Hunter, you're probably putting the neutral Imbue cards in your deck, and the neutral Imbue cards aren't beasts, therefore you're not really running a pure beast deck. So all those cards that are more pure beast aligned probably won't see any play in this deck. Finally, Hemet. He still exists, right? He's certainly going to see play now. But yeah, that's kind of where like the book lies with beasts. There also are some good beasts in Hunter right now. King Plush and Tyrannosaurus are pretty good beasts if you can get the cost reduced on them, and especially giving them attack up. Tyrannosaurus has Rush, so he can use the attack pretty quickly, right, when he plays it onto the field. And King Plush's effect actually gets improved by improving the attack of this card, so there is some stuff to like in the set currently. And then there are a few things in neutral land as well. Floppy Hydro obviously would like to get, attack buffs because he'll scale faster. Adaptive Amalgam is a beast amongst all other tribes. Again, he might like the enchantments as well. And then also you can tourist into Warrior, and Warrior has a hand buff package, including Undercooked Calamari, which is a beast that wants itself to get attack for an effect to go off. So there is actually a decent amount going on in Hunter right now in terms of beasts. Well, let's actually see now the cards. Spirit Bond, 3 mana nature spell. Deal 3 damage to a minion. If that kills it, summon a 3/2 wolf with Rush. I actually don't mind this card. I think this card is okay. It's like a solid card that you put in as like one of the 5 or 6 last cards you put into your deck. And you're pretty happy with it. It's honestly just an improvement on Flanking Strike. This is a spell that wouldn't see play anymore in Standard. It's just too weak. 4 mana for 3 damage to only a minion as well. And you get a 3/3 wolf on top of it. Spirit Bond is 1 mana cheaper. You're getting the 3 damage. It still is only to a minion. There is a criteria. You don't always get the wolf in case of Spirit Bond. You have to kill the minion. But if you do kill it, you're getting a 3/2 wolf with Rush, which I think is better than just a 3/3 wolf because you get fast stats, basically. Now, having an effect that is deal 3 damage to a minion, and if it kills it, is an effect that sees play actually in Standard. Currently, Froststrike sees a lot of play in a lot of Death Knight decks. Again, is one of these cards that is like the last 6 or so cards you fill your deck out with. This is 2 mana deal 3 damage, which I do appreciate does change the thresholds quite a lot. It's much, much easier for Froststrike to, kill off a minion on turn 2 than Spirit Bond will be on 3. That being said, the effect you get on Froststrike, Discover a Frost Rune card, is probably a 1 mana-ish effect. It's probably even less than a bit like a 1 mana effect. So I think it's fair enough that it's a 2 mana card. Spirit Bond, the 3/2 wolf with Rush, is about a 2 mana-ish effect. And you're on a 3 mana card. So I think all in all, the package, from a mana point of view, is actually not too uncomparable to Froststrike. The question mark is really just the breakpoints. On turn 3, you're more likely to go up against 4 health minion, which means that Spirit Bond won't quite as easily be able to kill it. But you still have to remember, you could trade minions in to lower that minion's health, and then use the Spirit Bond to kill them off. And even if you don't have anything to rush the 3/2 wolf into, you still got stats on the board, right? So I think this card is actually okay. One thing that's not okay about it, though, is it has no synergy with the Imbue power, because the beast goes into the field, not into your hand, but that's fine. Not everything has to synergize with the button, right? We also have Shepherd's Crook, 3 mana 3/2 weapon. After your hero attacks, summon a 3/3 sheep that's dormant for 2 turns, and this is the dormant sheep. It is a beast. It is dormant for 2 turns, and it's a 2 mana 3/3, as the card says. And the art, adorable. I love the art of it. I think it's so fantastical. Let's put it that way. Okay, let's start evaluating this card. I always find it really hard to evaluate cards with Dormant, so we'll deal with the weapon part of it first. A 3/2 weapon is Fiery War Axe. It's like the classic stat line on a weapon. Fiery War Axe, in the past, did see some play in Weapon Warrior decks. It's a pretty good stat line, honestly, for a weapon. You're going to get 6 damage eventually for 2 mana. It just takes 2 turns for you to get it, so it's not a million miles away from being like a standard-worthy card, honestly. Shepherd's Crook is 1 mana more, and you get the same stat line. However, you get 3/3 sheeps that are done for 2 turns, but again, the value is coming so much later down the line. I was actually having a look through for 3/3 dormant minions, and I came across Imprisoned Satyr. Imprisoned Satyr was a 3 mana 3/3 that was done for 2 turns, but obviously the big part of this card was it reduced a random minion in your hand by 5 when it eventually came out of dormancy, which in Druid is a big thing, because you normally in Druid have pretty big Druid deck type things, right, with ramp and stuff like that. Cheating cards out is kind of Druid's deal, so it's a bit unfair to do that. So I started to think about it, and I was like, if they printed in Hearthstone a minion which literally said 1 mana, done for 2 turns, summon a 3/3, would that see play in Standard? And after thinking about it for a while, I came to the conclusion I don't think it would see play in Standard. I think it's too slow. The dormancy for 2 turns is too like prohibitively expensive. So I actually think summoning a 3/3 Dormant Sheep for 2 turns is about a 0.75 mana-ish effect, there or thereabouts. You can hand wave if it's 0.5 or what, it doesn't matter. But I think it's a below 1 mana effect, which means Shepherd's Crook is basically cheating you out about half the mana worth of value because it's 1 mana more than a Fiery War Axe, which wouldn't normally see play in Standard. Do I think getting these sheeps really moves the needle? No, I actually think this card is a bit weak, to be honest with you. But again, take it with a pinch of salt. The entire set might be a little bit weak, so maybe Shepherd's Crook sneaks into decks again around this 29th and 30th card. By the way, also doesn't synergize with the button. But it's fine. Not every card has to synergize with the button. It's okay. You know, you're imbuing your button over the course of the game, playing cards that are not as good as cards you would like to play in Standard, all to buff your button to eventually get a payoff from doing all of this, like jumping through all these hoops. It's fine if the cards don't, work with the button. That's okay. Sure, it's fine. Then there's also the legendary minion Brawl Bear Mantle. 5 mana, 3/5. After you cast a spell, summon a random animal companion. Okay, normally when cards say after you cast a spell, historically, they're normally pretty good, almost regardless of what the effect says. I have, handpicked some particularly good ones. Lady Sithino? I never know how to pronounce this. Lady S. She used to be, I think, 2 attack on this card when she was, originally released, and was really strong, because every time you cast a spell, she would attack the lowest health enemy, which could be the face if there was no other minion on the board. And Demon Hunter had a lot of cheap spells, right? So you could machine gun people down with Lady S. Spitelash Siren in Naga Mage let you refresh mana crystals, and you could somewhat go infinite. Assuming the spells you were casting and the Nagas you were casting were below 2 cost, you would just infinitely be getting mana, and assuming those spells then were doing damage, you were machine gunning your opponent down. Cosmic Keyboard even, again, this was a mage. After you cast a spell, you get an elemental with cost equal to the cost of the spell. Sorry, you'd get stats on the elemental equal to the cost of the spell. Also saw play, this was a really, really strong card. So there is a lot of stuff going for him, because Brawl Bear Mantle, getting animal companions, they're pretty solid cards. By the way, if you've been living under a Leok, the animal companions of these 3 cards, it's Huffer, Leok, Misha. Normally, you want Huffer, because Huffer is a 4/2 charging beast. It's fine sometimes if you get a bunch of Huffers plus the Leok, because the Leok will then buff the charging minions. Normally, you don't want an entire board full of Leoks because, again, it's slow. Nor do you want a board full of Mishas because, again, it's a bit slow. It is a bit alarming that the card art has just a bunch of bears on it, which sort of, am I just going to get a bunch of bears from my Brawl Bear Mantle? Is this the sign? No, you should get a 1/3 chance of each of these, I believe, assuming the game works the way I think it does. But yeah, these, generally speaking, are good minions, especially for, the cost, so to speak. As long as you're casting spells below, 3 cost, you're going to get good minions, right? A 2 mana 4/2 charge, that's really good. A 2 mana 2/4 that gives all your other minions plus 1 attack, fantastic. 2 mana 4/4 taunt, yeah, these would all see play in Standard. So as long as you can play cheap stuff, you're fine. You do have to evaluate into the cost of Brawl Bear Mantle, though, as well, that you are paying 5 mana for a 3/5 on Brawl. Obviously, that's not a great deal. It's about a 3 mana stat line, which I would say was a competitive stat line for Standard. So you need to get 2 mana worth of value from this. But I think if you cast especially if you cast just a 1/0 cost spell, I think you've more than broke even. I think it's a really, really solid card. Now, there are some issues potentially with this. I gave you some hand-picked cherry examples of the ones where it does work with after you cast a spell effects. The ones where it doesn't work as well are normally the ones where the card itself that is the setup card are expensive, because it leaves you a little bit less mana to actually go off and combo people with. So all those cards I did before, I think were 4 mana or below. Brawl's actually a little bit higher than some of these cards. He's at 5 mana, but still, it's not terrible, right? It's not as painful as Hala, for example, which was an 8 mana card. Also, Hunter is a class that has a lot of cheap spells, right? Oh, and also, I forgot to mention, everyone can still ramp beyond 10 as well, so maybe you can actually cast more spells just because you'll go beyond 10 mana crystals. I actually don't think a lot of decks will run these, Sarah. I think it's actually not a great card, to be honest with you, but we'll see. Anyway, Hunter has got a lot of cheap spells. There is Tracking, for example, which is a 1 mana card, which potentially can discover another spell in your deck, which could be another cheap spell, which you could cast to get another animal companion from Brawl. Rexar's Gift is intrinsically 2 spells in 1 card. You can pick the cheap option and get 2 animal companions for it for about 3 mana. I do appreciate of all the gift cards out there, I think Rexar's is one of the weaker ones, but maybe if you need a bunch of spells. Alien Encounters as well, if you're putting this in the Discover deck, which, again, I mentioned earlier, Imbue is probably not going to go into the Discover deck, but if you do run some sort of Discover package with it, or it's just Brawl does go into the Discover deck, then you can get Alien Encounters pretty quickly down to 0 cost in that deck. In which case, for Brawl, that is fantastic fuel, right? There's then some other interesting options which I don't necessarily think will, work. You could use something like Monkey Business to try and fill your hand with bananas. They are 1-cost spells, which would go really nicely with Brawl. And you could buff the Brawl to make it harder for your opponent to kill the Brawl afterwards. Because obviously this is like the numero uno target for after you've done this turn. Because you don't want to let the Hunter just do the same thing on the next turn. If you buff him 3 or 4 times over the course of a turn, he's going to be really hard to remove. So, yeah. I don't think it'll work, but it's an interesting idea. There's also Cash Cow, and I do actually think this could have some legs. Put a Cash Cow on the board on a few turns earlier, you're probably going to get at least 2 coins from it, especially if it's some sort of minion-based interaction. Maybe it'll get just hard destroyed, but if someone's hard destroying the Cash Cow, they're going to have 1 fewer cards to hard destroy your Brawl, so I think it's not a bad idea. If you get 2 or 3 coins with Cash Cow, not only are they spells the coins, they're also giving you mana to cast on other spells to get the Brawl engine going. And if you're getting 6 Animal Companions from this, your opponent is going to have the worst day imaginable, unless you just draw all Mishas, or a combination of Mishas and Leox. Assuming you get 1 or 2 Huffers in there, that's going to be really scary, and the odds are, if you do 6 spells, you're going to get 2 Huffers and 2 Leox. That is pretty spooky, that's 12 damage. So, yeah, I think Cash Cow plus Brawl, match made in heaven. There's also some other, stuff that makes me positive for this interaction. Hunter had very recently a spell-ish package, where it had stuff like Mantle Shaper, for example, which wanted you to cast a bunch of spells to reduce the cost of Mantle Shaper to play the Mantle Shaper out early. And this card saw play in those decks, and was a strong card in those decks, and this was a 5-mana card. I do appreciate it got discounted for every spell you counted, but it worked. The one downside of this, though, is actually some of the cards that made that work are rotating out. For example, Bunch of Bananas is rotating out, which was basically 3 spells in 1 card and was great fuel. I would have definitely gone in the Brawl deck. That being said, there are still some alternatives that Hunters could do. They could use Cup of Muscle instead, for example, which is a card they can go into via the Tourist mechanic. Cup of Muscle has 3 drinks in it. It's basically 3 spells in 1. And instead of getting the stats directly on the board, the stats go into your hand. Which, based on the Imbue button, is what you want to do, because the Imbue button buffs your minions in hand. So any hand buffing effect maybe will synergize with this entire package. I will say again, it doesn't synergize with the button though. It's not a beast, and it generates beasts that go into the field, so you can't buff them. So it's fine. There's going to be cards, right? Amphibian Spirit, 2-mana nature spell. Give a minion +2/+2 and a death rattle. Give a friendly minion +2/+2 and this death rattle. Okay, it's basically Mecha Leaper on a spell. There are some upsides to this, actually, over Mecha Leaper. Firstly, it's, 1 mana cheaper. That being said, Mecha Leaper had a 2/2 stat line, which is about a 1 mana effect, I would say, for modern Hearthstone. Mecha Leaper had Magnetic as well, which, in mech packages would have worked nicely. Unfortunately for Mecha Leaper, there weren't particularly many great mech packages out there while it was around. And also, the Mecha Leaper's effect only spread the death rattle onto mechs, which is, again, the big weakness of it. Amphibian Spirit doesn't have that restriction. It's just any friendly minion. Which is pretty good, right? You can just put it onto a minion, have a bunch of tokens, have it die, it spreads to the other token, it spreads to the other token, it spreads to the other token, and, so on and so forth. And there are still token decks out there for Hunter. There's RC Rampage, for example, where you could fill your board with a bunch of hounds. You could buff one of them with the Amphibian Spirit, and if it dies, then the tokens, the death rattle on the token will spread to another token. And then that token dies, it spreads to another token, and so on and so forth. Obviously, the issue with this, though, is RC Rampage is kind of slow, right? The minions don't have rush or charge or anything like that. So what your opponent will just do on their next turn is kill all your other minions off. Leave your death rattle guy to last, kill it, then there's no minion on the board, and it diffuses the effect. So the real dream for Amphibian Spirit, and where it's got a lot of potential, and I kind of see this the Libram, the old Libram, which was give a minion +1/+1, was 2 mana and got reduced in cost by 1 for every Libram reducer you'd play during the course of the game, or whatever the cost reduction was on the Libram reducers. And when you got it down to 0, it would death rattle and come back into your hand. One of the powerful things about that card was you could put it on a minion with rush or charge or could attack that turn, trade into an opponent's minion, it would die, the card would come back to your hand for 0. You'd put it on another minion for 0, that could trade, and so on and so forth. It made your trading so much more better. Amphibian Spirit, it doesn't come back to the hand, but if you have some rushing boards, you can do a very similar thing. Now, I hate to say this because I don't really think Grace of the Great Wolf is a good card. It's not a great card, that's for certain. But if you had Grace of the Great Wolf and you summoned the 2/3/2 wolves with Rush, and you put an Amphibian Spirit on it, you could give the Rush 5/4 stat line. And if it died, the 2/2 would die and go into the other wolf, and you'd get a 5/4 stat line on that, which again has Rush, and you could trade that into something else. Is it worth it in the case of the Grace of the Great Wolf? Probably not, but maybe in other circumstances. For example, the Zergs. Maybe Zerg Hunter tries to do something like this. They fill the board with a bunch of Zerglings and other Zergs like it, and when spawning pool breaks, it gives all your Zergs Rush. And that's what you want with the Amphibious Spirit, right? A big board full of minions, and they all have Rush. And you could trade very favourably, basically even +2/+2 every minion that attacks, as long as one of them dies in the process. So that is the other restriction on it a little bit, that you're not guaranteed with a +2/+ stat line that the minion will die in the trade, but there's a decent chance you're going to die, especially if you're on a 1/1 minion to begin with. There's also Mother's Duck, for example, which might actually have some use with Amphibian Spirit. You summon the 3 1/1 ducklings with Rush. You give one of them +2/+2, you trade it in. There is a bit of RNG associated with this, because you might not get the +2/+2 on the other duckling. You might hit the Mother Duck instead and breaks the chain effectively, but maybe it's something you try. Also worth noting again that Terrascale Stalker is rotating into the core set. You could use Terrascale Stalker to trigger the Death Rattle of Amphibian Spirit, in which case you would have potentially 2 minions on the board. I mean, you'd have Terrascale Stalker and whatever you put the Amphibian Spirit on, and they would both have this effect. So if either one of them died, they would spread the effect onto the other guy, who would then have 2 times that effect. It just makes the hoops to diffuse it a little bit harder, because you'd have to kill one guy, then kill the other while no other thing is on the field. So there is a way to spread this around a little bit. Also worth noting, it's actually quite good with Brawl as well, because if you put it on Brawl, as I said before, Brawl's a minion you want to kill as soon as possible, because otherwise you get insane value on it. Amphibian Spirit is a card that you want to diffuse last. So you make your opponent have a decision. It's either you're going to kill Brawl, and you're going to spread this Death Rattle onto one of the Animal Companions, which may be a charging guy, by the way, but either way, it will probably be able to attack on the next turn, right? If you do that, then fantastic. I will just spread the Death Rattle around myself and get huge value from the Amphibian Spirit. Otherwise, you leave Brawl in the field, and you can just set up the turn again to do more Animal Companion stuff, and they have to make the same decision again the turn afterwards. So there is a lot of synergy between Brawl and Amphibian Spirit, and I think, actually, if Brawl sees in any play in the deck, I could see a world where Amphibian Spirit is also in that deck. By the way, just 2 mana, give a minion +2/+2 is not completely terrible. I've talked about this in the past before, where it's actually kind of deceptive if you're giving a card a certain stat line. You might say a 2/2, for example, for 2 mana is not a good deal. So why is giving a minion +2/+2 for 2 mana not a bad deal? And it's because giving a minion +2/+2, assume that minion can attack this turn, is effectively giving a minion charge, right? It's summoning a 2/2 with charge, so it's why there's not many cards where it's give a minion 8/8, for example. That couldn't be an 8 mana effect. It has to have a restriction on it. And that card has actually been printed before. The restriction was it can't attack the opponent on that turn, which, then gets around this type of effect. But yeah, I think this is quite a nice combo wombo. I will say again, doesn't synergize with the button at all. It's buffing a card on the board. It's not a beast. Okay, sure. I'm getting worried right now, Hearthstone team. We also have Exotic Houndmaster. 2 mana 2/2, Battlecry, draw a beast, imbue your hero power. Okay, we are getting closer and closer. Exotic Houndmaster has the effect of draw a beast. This was on Peaceful Piper. Peaceful Piper saw some play. Also was threatening to be a Tongue Twister. Peaceful Piper was a 1 mana 1/1. Exotic Houndmaster is a 2 mana 2/2. It's harder to potentially, weave in a 2/2 into a play versus the 1/1. In fact, it's twice as hard, right? It's twice the mana cost. Nevertheless, it's still not too hard, right? It's only easy with a 0 cost or the 1 cost. Next easiest is 2 cost. A reasonable effect, 2 mana 2/2, you're getting a tutor. Fine, not too bad. And actually, even more beneficial on top of that, it's got an effect beyond Peaceful Piper. You imbue your hero power, and I've sort of said already, a bit hand-wavy. I'm going to treat Imbue as about a 1 mana-ish effect. It's probably a little bit less than 1 mana, but it gets your button scaling going. It's also worth noting in this Imbue example as well, compared to Druid, for example. Druid could start the game with the Imbue on because of their legendary card. In the case of Hunter, you will start with the Hunter hero power, and until you start like imbuing, you know, over and over again, you're not going to get a button as quickly as they do. So Exotic Handmaster playing it on 2 will just turn you into the 2 mana button, give a beast in your hand plus a random beast, plus 1 attack, and reduce the cost by 1. Is that better than the current hero power for Hunter? Probably not. I think you would actually need another imbue on top of that. So it gets the chain going, so it's kind of fine, right? Another card I would actually say this is not too dissimilar to even is Cactus Cutter, which is actually a card that has seen a lot of play in Shaman. This was a 2 mana 2/2 Murloc, which drew a spell, aka it shooted. And in the case of Cactus Cutter, if you could play that spell as well, you get +1/+2 and taunt on top of this minion, which I would sort of treat as again, it's like a mana-ish effect, mana plus maybe even. Imbuing your hero power I think is slightly below 1 mana, but you don't have to jump through any hoops for it, so I think it's a solid card. If Imbue hero power Hunter is going to work, this card certainly goes in that deck. Doesn't synergize with the button though. Well, it minorly synergizes with the button. It isn't a beast, so it can't get hit by the Blessing of the Wolf, but it draws you a beast to get hit by the button. We're getting closer, guys. We're getting closer. Alright, here we are. Mythical Runebear. 4 mana, 3/4. Beast. Taunt Battlecry. If this has 4 or more attack, summon a copy of this. It synergizes with the button! Let's go! Let's go! By the way, I could have done this in a slightly different order. In case you're wondering why this, you know, has been prepared the way it was, this was the chronological release of the Hunter cards, and I kept, like, watching them. It's like, nothing here works with the Imbue button. Like, none of this has any synergy whatsoever. I was like, surely they're going to release something, and like, at the last moment on the day, it's like, oh, here's a beast. Actually, there's another beast coming up, but here's some beasts that work with your button. I was like, yes! I don't know why you, like, teased me so much, but I thought I would tease you the same way the Hearthstone team teased me. Anyway, getting back to the card itself, Mythical Runebear, this is actually pretty spooky, honestly. Why do I say this? Well, there was a card in Druid back in a few years ago. I think this was Saviors of Uldum, right? Where there was a questline for Druid, which resulted in the Assyrian Tear, and I believe the questline was to have unspent mana for either 3 or 4 turns. I think it was 4, I can't remember though, maybe it was 3. Either way, you had to jump through some hoops in the way that you played the game early, and your reward was the Assyrian Tear, which meant that if you played a card with choose 1 effect, you would get both effects. And Oasis Surge was a card that was so powerful in that deck, because getting both the effects in the Oasis Surge turned it into a 5 mana 5/5 that summoned a copy of itself. Now you may be getting to see the analogy here. Mythical Runebear, if you can give this more than 4 attack, which all you need to do is imbue your button 1 time, and push the button, and have it hit the Mythical Runebear. I say all, it's actually quite a steep ask, to be honest with you, but if you can do that, you're paying for 3 mana because you'll get a 1 mana reduction. You're going to get 8/8 stat line for taunt, with taunt as well. That's pretty good, honestly. Now, it's not quite true that this is the case. Similar with the Oasis Surger, it wasn't super true that it was a 5 mana, like 10/10 stat line with, Rush. Because you had to lose mana in the build-up to it, which was effectively mana that, you could have used to spend on other better cards. So you're paying for the cost in the early turns. And if you're going to pay for something, it is better to do it early rather than later, because it's typically more amenable to lose tempo early and recover versus losing tempo a bit later into the game. So going back to the Mythical Runebear, as long as you can play one of the Imbue cards, and we've seen that a few of the Imbue cards are below 4 mana, it's one of the neutrals and the card we just saw, whose name's escaped me. Actually, the other Imbue card for Hunter is 4 mana, so it's actually hard to play that one before Mythical Runebear. It's a bit harder to play before Mythical Runebear. And the other neutral is also 4 mana, so there is a bit of a timing issue on this card, so I think it's somewhat inconsistent you're going to get to play this around 3 or 4. In fact, I think you're almost certainly never going to play this on 3. You'd need the coin, really, because you'd play your 2 mana Imbue guy, you wouldn't have any mana left over for the button. On turn 3, you would push the button. You'd have to hope, assuming you're running more than like this beast in your deck, that it hits the Mythical Runebear. And in that case, on 4 for 3 mana, you're playing 8/8 stats with taunt, so it's a pretty good deal, but it's a little bit clunky, I think, to get there. Also, unlike Oasis Surge, this is not as fast as it doesn't have Rush. It has taunt instead, so it's a pretty good wall, especially if there was any aggressive decks out there. This is a nightmare for them, right? If you get this as a 4/4 taunt, copies itself, basically gave yourself 8 additional health. Nightmare for aggro decks out there. Also worth noting, you don't necessarily have to do this with the imbue stuff either. You could use bird watching, for example, discover a mythical rune bear from your deck. That gives it 5 attack. I mean, in fact, it turns it to a 5/5, right? It will have more than 4 attack. You won't get the mana reduction in this case, so you have to play it on 4, but it's 4 mana for 10/10 taunt stats. That's better than the Oasis Surger, depending on how you value taunt, versus Rush. And actually, even more to the point, you maybe just don't run this in the imbue deck whatsoever. Maybe you put this in Discover Hunter instead. You get the Discover with bird watching, and then you get 2 of these with 5/5s on them, plus the one that's in your deck that could then get discovered down the line. And yeah, this would be truly disgusting to have lots of them that you could just splash onto the board. You know, again, copying this with Rangari Scout. Yeah, that's quite frightening, honestly. But again, it has a bit of an anti-synergy with the imbue button, because you would want the Discover button over the imbue button. There's then also stuff like Nexus Prince Jafar, for example, where you could put the spell burst of that onto this, you play the minion, it summons a copy of itself, they both get the spell burst. Obviously, Nexus Prince Jafar has been changed now that you can't just get the spell burst all copied onto one minion in your hand, but if there were 2 other minions in your hand, let's say, they could spread the spell burst onto 2 other guys. So I think Nexus Prince and Mythical Rune Bear, maybe that sees play as well. Maybe it's in the imbue package, maybe it's not in the imbue package. And actually, to go beyond this, there is also a hand buff package in Hunter/Warrior, which again you can tourist into. You just hit a cup of muscle on this, that turns you into the 5/5 stat line. Maybe you use Char, which is actually not seeing really any play right now, but Char and minion, you get onto the Mythical Rune Bear, the excess stats. Maybe that's good enough. Only, like, slight downsides is some of the cards we've seen earlier, like Amphibious Spirit, doesn't work with this. It has to be something that buffs the card in your hand, whereas a lot of the Hunter cards right now... Actually, Hunter's got a really weird selection of cards right now. They had both hand and board buffing cards. A lot of the board buffing cards have rotated out now, but... They've added another one in Amphibian Spirit, but it doesn't work with this card. Also, I guess worth mentioning, there is a new card called Dreambound Raptor that's going to come out in the neutral set, which is also a beast. And it gives a minion a random bonus effect after you play it. Maybe you play the Dreambound Raptor as this like 1 excess mana I talked about, because at best you're probably playing this on turn 4 for 3. In which case you would copy the bonus effect since the Mythical Rune Bear copies itself. However, you would actually run like a bit foul of the Blessing of the Wolf effect, because when I originally saw this, I sort of assumed you would run a bunch of beasts in your deck and you don't really care where the value goes. Like, you would just be playing this as some sort of mid-rangey like deck where you cheat out some good beast a bit early, and that puts on enough pressure for you to eventually win the game. But you can't really put in like very cheap beasts, because they might get hit by the Blessing of the Wolf, and sure, they get the attack, but the mana reduction is just not worth it. So I actually think this deck will run like a very, very specific package of beasts, like a very small amount, maybe even only like 6 to 8 beasts in that deck. And it will just be beasts that get a benefit from gaining either plus attack or the mana cost reduction. But I think mainly on the plus attack is where you're going to be aiming for. This was the other beast I alluded to before. Don't worry, there is another card that synergizes with the button. It's Verdant Dreamsaber. 5 mana 4/7 beast, Battlecry. If this costs 3 or less, attack 2 random enemy minions. This card is so unbelievably awkward to evaluate. Normally I like to peg a card to something, but I just couldn't think of a great way to peg this to something. The closest thing I think I could actually think of, which is like kind of fair, is something like Infiltrator Lillian, where it didn't attack immediately, right? Infiltrator Lillian went into stealth and had a death rattle on it. So on the turn after you played it, it should still be on the board because it's hard to target and kill a stealth minion. Then you would trade Infiltrator Lillian into someone, and this would summon another 4/2 Lillian, which would immediately attack an enemy. So it was very slow compared to the Verdant Dreamsaber. However, I will say on the Infiltrator Lillian, you did have to jump through hoops to get there, because Verdant Dreamsaber, you have to reduce the cost by 2, which is actually normally a pretty hard ask. Other cards I considered this to that are a bit more faster as well, something like the Factory Assembly Bot, or just any of these cards that say at the end of your turn, summon something and attack a random minion. But again, this is kind of powerful because it's on a battle cry, so you can actually respond with other cards in your hand or other plays to what the results are from this guy attacking. So Factory Assembly Bot, you can't do that. You're just at the, You're at the will of the gods at that point, what the 6/7 thing hits. Then I started to think of stuff like hulking Overfiend, because again, it doesn't really take into account the multi-attacking aspect of it, whereas stuff like hulking Overfiend, where it was like on Batterhead, where it killed the guy, it could attack again, do sort of take that into account. But again, it's not really the same, right? And eventually I settled on, if you get this effect off, you're close to something like Avenging Wrath. Perhaps it's best to just evaluate this as a spell stat line, where you're getting 8 damage split amongst enemies, and it's enemy minions specifically, but it's not split up as ones, it's split up as 2 actions of 4. Now, obviously you can get better than Avenging Wrath with this, because you can buff the attack as well, in which case the effect gets better and better and better. And actually, I think it's not too unfair to evaluate it like this, because just getting back to the card again, you're getting 11 stats for 5 mana, which is about par for the course. There's a decent chance, though, around turn 5, which is still probably where you're playing it, even at the reduction cost to 3. It's too many hoops to jump through to realistically do this before around 5. But around 5, if you hit 2 minions, you're probably going to die with 7 health. It's not really a big enough stat line for it to survive. So you're probably getting this 8+ stat line off. Another card, after I went like thinking through all of this, it's not too similar to something like Testing Dummy, where instead of having it on the Death Rattle, it's like on the Battle Cry instead, but you had the stat line as well associated with it. So this thing might live at the end of all of this, whereas Testing Dummy, you get the effect, but only after it's died, but you still got the stat line to begin with. And then, again, Testing Dummy had other effects around it, where you could, trigger the Death Rattle other ways. It was a mech, so you had mech buffing type things, mech resummoning type things. Verdant Dreamsaber has those things with Beast as well, and anything that gives it attack also improves its effect. So I see them kind of quite similar, Testing Dummy to Verdant Dreamsaber, in terms of like a power level. That I can see a world where Verdant Dreamsaber gets pretty spooky, but even saying that, Testing Dummy actually threatens the opponent's face as well, whereas Verdant Dreamsaber doesn't really do that. Anyway, obviously the intention of this is to use it with the button. Now, I will say, compared to the other card where you only had to imbue the button once and then push the button once and hit it to get the effect off, Verdant Dreamsaber needs you to do this twice. Or imbue 2 times and push the button once and then hit this, more specifically. Because if you only get 1 mana reduction on it, it only turns into a 4 mana card, which won't trigger its effect. And before you imbue 1 time, you're not in this button. So you need to imbue to get this button, imbue again to get the +2 attack and +2 reduction in it. Then you need to push the button, hit the Verdant Dreamsaber, and ideally do all this before turn 5, which is theoretically possible, but somewhat unlikely is the way I'm going to put this. So, again, I think this is the problem with the Hunter deck, where you could get some pretty high rolls, but equally you can get some really low rolls, and is the hoops worth jumping through for doing all of this? Like, it's like a 3-step process where you're taking tempo down plays, especially if you're pushing the button, because the button, at the end of the day, is 2 mana do nothing for, like, the early imbues at the very least, because you're probably not going to have to play the card after you've pushed the button that you've reduced. Even with the 1 mana reduction or the 2 mana reduction, you still probably couldn't play those cards. So it's kind of like, I passed my turn, I play 2 mana, pass. Yeah, I think it's pretty hard. What I will say, though, is another way you could look at the Verdant Dreamsaber at this point is if you do get it to the +2 attack 2 reduction stage, you're then playing a 3 mana 6/7 that's going to attack 2 things, which is a lot of damage. But again, is it a lot better than Testing Dummy? And the hoops you can jump through to get effects from Testing Dummy. At the end of the day, you can just put Testing Dummy on the board, even without the copy Death Rattle stuff, even without the immediately resurrect mech stuff. It's still a body you can put on the board. Verdant Dreamsaber, if you don't get the effect of it, it's really bad. Like, it's a super bad card, like below an arena play even. There are some other upsides to this. It obviously would work with Galdron as well if you can get the effect to go off, which would mean you're doing big, massive damage. And the final card I'll just compare this to, since I've compared it to every card in fucking Hearthstone at this point, is Cascading Disaster. So Cascading Disaster, I think this was in the mini set for Madness of the Dark Moon Fair, and it was a spell in Warlock which destroyed minions, but every time you corrupted it, it would destroy an additional minion, up till 3. This card's sort of a bit of play in Control, Warlock, and I see Corruption as a very similar mechanic to Imbue, in a sense that you have to jump through hoops to eventually get a payoff. And for a lot of the Corrupt cards, it wasn't worth the payoff, right? Even though you're paying, like, for example, 4 mana to get a 7 mana worth of value. You had to at some point have played like an 8 mana card. By the point you can get the mana cheat, it was late into the game, where your opponent could deal with it. Similar with the Verdant Dreamsaber, sure you could get this down to like a 3 mana 6/7 that attacks 2 times, but you're probably not playing that till at least 5, but more realistically it's going to be 6 or 7, by which point your opponent can deal with it. Anyway, to get back to this interaction, if you get Verdant Dreamsaber just like buffed up enough, you've imbued your button enough times, you've pushed the button enough times, you've hit this guy, at the end of the day, all it is, you know, maybe eventually 0 mana, deal like 8 damage to 2 minions or 10 damage to 2 minions, which at that point is virtually just destroy 2 guys. It's the same as Cascading Disaster, but you don't have to go through as many painful hoops, because I think Corrupting was, especially on Cascading Disaster, wasn't as painful, right, because it was only 5 more mana cost cards you had to pay, and you only have to do that 2 times. For Verdant Dreamsaber, you have to push the imbue stuff pretty hard and push the button many times, so maybe somewhat comparable. I think it's just worse than the Cascading Disaster, for example. And I wouldn't say Cascading Disaster either was an unbelievably powerful card. It was just like good in control decks. One final thing I'll say on this card as well is Detailed Notes exists in Hearthstone. It's actually not seeing any play in the Discover package right now. It's like one of the Discover cards that was added in that set and is not seeing any play. But this is a 5 or more cost discoverable beast. And if you hit this, it gets the cost reduction from the Detailed Notes, in which case the Verdant Dreamsaber effect goes off early. That may actually be the best chance you ever can get of playing this on 3, is you put Detailed Notes in your deck. So again, maybe this is a draw to put Detailed Notes in your Discover Hunter deck, especially considering Titanfall Traps is going to rotate out of that deck, which is one of the big Discover cards you put into that deck. Perhaps you just, like, you know, roll the dice and hope that you hit Verdant Dreamsaber. Because actually, generally speaking, Hunter has a lot of good beasts that cost 5 or more, so you can't really miss at the end of the day. So yeah, this is the package for imbuing, in my opinion. I've just put Goldgen on here because I think a lot of it is, you know, beast related, so Verdant Dreamsaber, Mythical Runebear, Umbracore, Exotic Houndmaster, Flutterwing Guardian, and Bitter Bloom Knight from the neutrals. Good? I'm not sure. I'm really, really not sure. Now, there are some other upsides which I didn't really mention earlier. Almost all of these are battle cries, with the exception of Umbraclaw, which is, you know, a Death Rattle, or Goldgen, which is just an aura, which means they work with Parrot Sanctuary. And if you could Parrot Sanctuary and cheat some of these guys out a bit earlier as well, especially imbue enabling cards, okay, that makes it a bit more palatable as well. And also, as I said, there are some really good beasts out there in Hunterland right now. You could use King Plush, for example. Maybe you just keep imbuing the button more and more and more times. And a bit like Hand Buff Hunter, where eventually you'd get to the point where you had Leroy Jenkins as some sort of lethal mechanic. Maybe you just get to the point where King Plush gets, like, you know, 12 attack stat lines. Its cost reduced down to, like, close to 0. And you put King Plush into the board. Every minion gets bounced back into their owner's hands, which basically clears the board right at that point. Very few minions won't get, you know, bounced back with that type of stat line. And you just drop a Goldgen on the board with your King Plush, and that is lethal. You only need to get it actually up to 15, assuming, you know, your opponent hasn't gained armor or is a Death Knight and can go beyond normal health ranges. That is just going to be lethal. So maybe that's the package, but that verges on the realm of being a control package, in my opinion, whereas I think the aim of this is to be more mid-rangey. You don't really want to play Control Hunter because Control Hunter isn't really a great thing. Also, one of the good cards that actually could kind of make Control Hunter work within the last year, Star Power, has rotated out, so there really aren't many good control options beyond this. And the only thing you would be really doing is just playing a bunch of understated cards all the way up until the late game, which normally is not a great idea, but again, we'll see where the power level lies. But currently, I don't fully see this. One other thing I could mention, because again, if you're really after charging beasts being your win condition, you could use Patchwork Pals as well to put some beasts into your hand, which again, you could reduce the cost of and increase the stat line of to make your Huffers supercharged. But I think you'd probably, at that point, more inclined to only run very few beasts, aka you'd probably put Goldgen in there, Verdant Dreamsaber, Mythical Runebear, Plush. Maybe that's it. Maybe you don't even run the Umbraclaw, because again, it's a beast where you don't really want it to take the stat lines because it doesn't get a huge benefit, except it is synergizing with Rush somewhat, but maybe the other things just give you more bang for your buck, so you wouldn't run that. But again, you probably wouldn't want to put other beasts into your deck to, like, interrupt this, so I don't see that. The other package I think Hunter is, like, aimed towards is some sort of, like, spell-based Hunter deck. I've just put Shepherd's Crook on here because I don't think it'll go into any deck, to be honest with you, but we've just put him here. Brawl, I actually think, is a pretty good card. It's just whether or not a package will exist around him to work. Grace of the Great Wolf is complete garbage that won't see any play. Even with a nerf to... Like, how many cards in Hearthstone would have to get nerfed to make Grace of the Great Wolf see play? You'd be verging on the point of stuff like... Chillwind Yeti would have to get a stat line nerf for fucking Grace of the Great Wolf to see play. It'd be that type of scenario. It's so, like, classic stat line based that it's just horrible. But Spirit Bond, Amphibian Spirit with Brawl, maybe that could work. But again, it's just where does the package exist around this? I was thinking maybe like you could have done some sort of secret package, but even then, you're losing a lot of the good secret package cards, so I just don't see a world right now where Brawl sees play. But maybe it goes into the Discover package. And actually, getting down to all of this, I kind of think that the Discover package is just going to be king. And actually, even more like insidious than that. And I think this is actually a really bad design aspect on this set. I'll mention this again a little bit later on. The Imbue versus Dark Gift mechanic. I kind of hate that classes that aren't Dark Gift classes, like Hunter, can use the Dark Gift mechanic. Whereas classes that are Dark Gift focused can't use the Imbue mechanic. They don't have an Imbue button if you're not one of the Imbue classes. Because it makes things that, like, kind of suck. Because I kind of think that Dark Gift Hunter will be better than Imbue Hunter. Because the Dark Gift stuff is all based on discovering. And Discover Hunter already has a mechanic, right? It has Exarch Nael and Rangari Scout. What if you just drop a Nightmare Lord Xavius into your deck? It's a Discover card, right? And you could get copies of it with Rangari Scout. And what if you hit Grifter or something like this? You'll get 2 Grifters, right? You'll just extend the amount of value you're getting. Bearing in mind as well, some of these Dark Gifts include double the Battle Cry. You might have to play Grifter and get, 4 times the value off your Grifter as well. So I think because all the Dark Gift cards in the neutral land have Discover on them, you might want to try and put these in your Discover Hunter deck. And assuming if Dark Gifts are actually better than I'm making them out to be, which actually I think they're about a 2-mana-ish effect, so I think they're pretty decent. I could see a world where Discover Dark Gift Hunter is better than Imbue Hunter. Even at, like, what it's meant to be doing, which is just gaining value. Also, Raptor Herald, which, by the way, there is a quest line right now in the game to get Raptor Herald, so log into Hearthstone and play now to complete the event and get this card. But Raptor Herald can discover a beast with a Dark Gift. What if you Rangari Scout this, and you get Goldrin with Charge, for example? That's 18 damage. I mean, it's lethal, right? You'll have 2 cards with 18 damage in your hand. Obviously, there's, like, a choice of 9 or 10, depending on which ones Goldrin couldn't hit. Because Goldrin couldn't get the double Battle Cry one, so it would be of 9. But that type of shit is going to happen. You're just going to generate a really good card with a good effect. And actually, we've seen some other beasts which actually work quite nicely with the Dark Gift as well. So I sincerely think that Dark Gift Hunter might be better than Imbue Hunter, which I think sucks for the Dark Gift decks that they can't steal the Imbue cards and become an Imbue deck either. Really, really, like, weird design choice. Some final things as well for this Discover deck. Meadow Strider is coming into the game in the new set. That would be a really annoying card to get into your deck and continuously discover and copy this card, because it would be coming back out as a 1-cost card, and you'd just be creating an endless wall of Meadow Striders. And what's even more, like, insidious with this deck is you could Trusty Fishing Rod the Meadow Striders back out. So you could effectively turn your, like, the bottom end of your deck into 6 Meadow Striders and keep discovering them with your button back into the, your hand. You could Fishing Rod them to, like, summon them from the deck. And I think you could legitimately get into a state of, I just put up this big wall, break me down. And I think that's going to be a really frustrating deck to play with. So I can see more stuff with the Discover package, with the new cards, than any of the other stuff. So watch this space, but I'm not convinced. Anyway, the next one we're going to deal with is Rogue. Rogue, we've seen Ashenmane, which sort of implied we're going to get a Burgle package, and Barbed Thorn, which I actually thought implied we were going to get some sort of weapon package. We didn't, so Barbed Thorn is just the odd. Barbed Thorn is a bit of an odd one out. Anyway, let me get down to the cards. Mimicry. 1 mana spell for Rogue. Your opponent draws 2 cards. You get copies of them. Okay. On first glance, this card is shit, right? It's completely shit. Any effect which is symmetrical is normally bad unless you can abuse the symmetry. However, this isn't really like... it is a symmetrical effect, but it's not like symmetrical in the fact that it's beneficial to both sides. Because normally, getting cards from your opponent isn't very conducive to what you're doing in your deck. Normally, you want refined cards with a game plan of, this is how I'm going to win the game, and putting these 30 cards in my deck to achieve that. You don't just take 2 of your opponent's cards and go like, oh yes, this is going to make my deck much better now. They normally make your deck worse. We'll get to this going forwards, though, because there are reasons to get copied cards and why this card actually could be good. But anyway, just to get to other cards this is like, it's similar to Frozen Over. Frozen Over is 2 mana, so it's, twice the mana or 1 mana more. Both players drew 2 cards, so you would get cards that, you put in your own deck, which normally are better than cards just, copying from your opponent. And your opponent couldn't play them on the next turn, so it was a slight asymmetry. Frozen Over did see a bit of play in Frost Death Knight decks, which just tried to, machine gun people down with spells. But since then, hasn't really seen much play since it got nerfed. There's also Paraglide, which was both players draw 3 cards. Again, we're drawing cards, not just stealing them from my opponent, or copying them from my opponent, sorry. If you could outcast it, though, only you would get the effect. So again, you could break the asymmetry favourable for you. Mimicry, you can't do this, right? You can't really break the symmetry in a way that is favourable for you, unless there is a benefit for your opponent drawing cards and you not drawing cards. Or, the second case, getting cards that weren't in your deck is an upside. And both of these things could be a reality. I just want to compare this again to another card, Cold Light Oracle. This card has seen play in many rogue decks in the past. And this sees play in mill decks. If you don't know what a mill deck is, maybe you're new to cards. Mill decks are normally a different way of beating, card games. They exist, certainly in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think they exist in Magic as well. I don't know if Pokemon has this type of thing, but rather than, competing with your opponent based on, the normal rules of the game, your idea is, I'm going to cause you to draw every card you've got in your deck, or burn every card in your deck if you can't draw them, and when you can't draw any more cards, I win the game. Some games are literally if you can't draw a card, you lose. In the case of Hearthstone, if you can't draw any cards anymore, you start taking more and more fatigue damage. So there were Cold Light Oracle decks out there, which caused you to draw a bunch of cards. Your opponent would run out of cards, and they would start fatiguing, and they would die. And normally you would break the symmetry of the Cold Light Oracle by having some sort of card in your deck that, put cards back into your deck again, so you wouldn't be equally burning one another. Mimicry doesn't have this issue that Cold Light Oracle has, because you're not drawing cards. Your opponent's drawing cards, you're copying them. So if you could get Mimicry to go off multiple times during the course of a turn, you would just fill your hand with copies until you get to the point where you can't hold any more copies. Your opponent, though, would endlessly be drawing cards. So if you could get Mimicry to go off 10 or 15 times, you could easily put Mimicry in a mill deck. And I think this is where Mimicry eventually will gain a toxic status of this is such a good card in mill decks. Fortunately for Standard, I don't think there's a lot of ways to abuse this right now. Tidepool Pupil would let you get a copy of this, but it's a bit of a slow slog to get there. Also worth mentioning, Sonya Water Dancer was nerfed in case you're not aware of it. It only copies 1-cost minions now, not 1-cost spells. If it did 1-cost spells and you could Mimicry Sonya and Tidepool, maybe there was some realm for a mill deck out there, but I don't see enough good ways to get copies of Mimicry that are guaranteed copies. Again, Fizzle is also rotated out as well, so copying stuff right now that are spells is actually quite hard in the game, so I think Mimicry won't get abused for a mill deck in Standard. In Wild, though, all bets are off. Which then leads me to case 2, where I said there are other advantages to having copies of cards from your opponent. If those cards are not in your class, it works with the Burgle cards, and Rogue has a Burgle package, which never works. Burgle Rogue has never, ever worked. Ever. Because getting random cards is inherently random. So you're just relying on the grace of the gods to get you there, and normally that doesn't work. For example, in the case of Test Greymane, even if you get cards randomly from other classes, what if you generate a card that kills Test in the process of Test's effect going off? It breaks the Test cycle, so you die via that effectively. So you have to be really careful with the cards you get. Some of them aren't playable for you. They then fill up your hand with junk. Sometimes you'll generate cards that draw cards, so when you play Test, you draw through your entire deck. It's just, it just doesn't work. Or it does work, but it works 1 in every 10 games, and you're like, oh my god, this was an insane game. I've made my opponent rage quit. They've definitely all F4'd at this point. But then you lose the other 9 games, so then you cry. There's then stuff like Treasure Hunter Eudora, which, is okay as well for playing cards from other classes. Snatch and Grab's a decent payoff. Conniving Conman is a pretty good payoff, assuming you get a good card from another class. Seashell as well could reduce the cost of those cards. And Conniving Conman and Seashell did see play in a mage deck when you could tourist into Rogue, and these cards said from a different class. They've changed these so that wouldn't work, because the mage Tourist into Rogue deck was super strong. So they've gone back to being in the state where they saw no play, because Burgle packages aren't that good. And if you want to know how bad Burgle packages are right now in Rogue, Maestro and Masked Merchant can literally turn Rogue into a different class. So all your Rogue cards are cards from other classes, which means that you can fill your deck with cards from other classes that you know what the cards are, and it still isn't good enough. It's still too many hoops to jump through in the case of Maestro. It doesn't work. It's too slow, bad. But yeah, let's now go back to Mimicry. Mimicry is getting copies of cards that your opponent draws. Hey, issues with this. What if you generate a neutral card? That's not a card from another class, so that won't work with your Burgle package. What if you're playing against a Rogue? They're not cards from other classes either, so womp womp. And as I alluded to earlier, what if you generate a card that is from a different class, but is garbage, like it has no synergy with your deck? Then you're just playing like a 5-mana 3/6, which is not worth it. Or actually, in the case of certain cards, you might generate a card which is actively destructive towards like Test, for example, and you just can't play it, which means the card is always in your hand. And if you ever play it, you lose the game, because then your Test won't ever give you value. And then finally, what if you generate an Imbue card? I mentioned it earlier where I think the Imbue Dark Gift package is a terrible design choice. Either all the classes should have an Imbue, or it should have all been Dark Gift, in my opinion. Or the classes that don't have Imbue should have had a neutral Imbue situation. But if you generate an Imbue card with Mimicry, they're going to be shit. Like, 2 mana restore 4 health is garbage, because the Imbue effect will fizzle. So, yeah, it's got some issues in this card. I will concede, I'm not really showing you the full package, because there is a package of cards from other that didn't start in your deck in Rogue. Let's deal with another one of these, like, getting cards from your opponent. Tricky Satyr, 3 mana 4/2 demon. Battlecry, get a copy of the lowest cost card in your opponent's hand. Fine. 3 mana 4/3 is like the pass stat line for a minion. You get a copy of the card, so it's 3 mana 4/3 get a card, but it's probably a below average card, especially since it's the lowest cost card, and lowest cost cards normally are the lowest quality cards as well. Some cases that isn't true, but for a general rule of thumb, it's fairly true. This isn't a million miles away from Blink Fox. Blink Fox had a 1 fewer stat line. However, Blink Fox could generate strong cards, whereas Tricky Satyr can't really generate too many strong cards unless your opponent only has like 1 card in their hand, in which case, you might get lucky. Maybe you'll generate a Wild God, for example, from Tricky Satyr. But generally speaking, Blink Fox, you could just drop it onto the board and you'd get some sort of value from it. Also, Blink Fox isn't good enough to see play in Standard anymore. Tricky Satyr, probably the same thing. It gives you a bit of also knowledge, so it's actually got some advantages. Compared to Blink Fox, you'll know that your opponent has this card in their hand. Another card to compare this to is actually Madame Lazul from Priest, because Priest is the other class that has like a Thief package normally. Madame Lazul did see some play in a lot of Priest decks, 3 mana 3/2 minion, which let you discover a copy of a card in your opponent's hand. But again, it wasn't the lowest cost card. You got to look at 3 cards in your opponent's hand, and you could pick the best one of those. So it has a lot of advantages. I actually think Madame Lazul is considerably better than Tricky Satyr. I think if Rogue could run Madame Lazul or Tricky Satyr, they'd run Madame Lazul, even though it is 2 fewer stat lines. It's just better knowledge, get a better quality card, phenomenal. They also have Nightmare Fuel, 1 mana spell, discover a copy of a minion in your opponent's deck, combo with a Dark Gift. This is the only Dark Gift card in Rogue, by the way. This is like the thing that's propping up Dark Gift in Rogue, which again, I think is a really weird mechanic that the set sort of doesn't really refer to. At least the classes don't seem to refer to it too much. But yeah, the card itself, discover a copy of a minion in your opponent's deck, is the effective cloning device, a card that saw no play in Priest. Now, if you can combo this, and normally you can combo cards in Rogue, because Rogue has got a bunch of cheap cards, you get a Dark Gift on top of it, which is about a 2 mana buff to the card. Would cloning device see some play, with like a 2 mana upside on top of it as well? Probably. Like, if it was like, discover a copy of a minion in your opponent's deck and draw, I don't know what it would be, draw 2 cards. That probably, in fact, I definitely would see play now. I think about it for like more than a microsecond. But even if it's just a draw a card, maybe then it would have seen some play. So, yeah, I don't think it's a million miles away. A bit of a boring card, honestly, but it's fine. Another card it's somewhat similar to in Rogue is Parlay, where you got to copy a card from your opponent's deck, but you actually swapped it. Like, you put the Parlay in your opponent's deck and you would get the card. And then your opponent could draw the Parlay going forward and then, steal a card from your deck, put the Parlay into your deck again. And that would, like, repeat through the game. Obviously, not Discovery, so you're not getting the best option, which you do get on Nightmare Fuel or Cloning Device, so it's probably worse. And also, the Dark Gift is definitely a big draw. Alright, so why are we doing this? What is the actual end goal of this? This is the end goal. It's Shadow Cloaked Assailant. 4 mana, 3/5 demon. Battle Cry. If you're holding one of the same cards as your opponent, shuffle theirs into their deck. Okay, this is a really powerful effect. Almost every time a card exists which causes your opponent to discard or, shuffle cards back from their hand into their deck, the card sees some sort of play or destroys the cards in some way, like, Boom Boss did. Because causing your opponent to lose cards is very strong. It's a very powerful effect. So powerful, in fact, that we've actually seen this type of mechanic in Rogue before, in Ghastly Gravedigger, which worked in secret Rogue decks. And this effect was so good because you got to choose the card in your opponent's hand to shove back into the deck. People would Shadow Step Ghastly Gravedigger multiple times, play it multiple times in the course of a turn, cause them to lose 3 cards, and that was basically GG. You would just lose the game from there. Because then your opponent is playing top deck Hearthstone until they draw a card that draws a bunch of, other cards. Some sort of refill, which a lot of decks didn't have. So yeah, based on this evidence, anything that would cause your opponent to lose cards is going to be good. Now, the issue in the case of Shadow Cloaked Assailant versus Ghastly Gravedigger is Ghastly Gravedigger was considerably easier to set up. Having a secret on the board in Rogue with their secret pool actually wasn't too unreasonable. And also, you got to choose a card. You didn't have to be holding the card as well. Now, obviously, this is where this entire package comes into play. The Mimicry, the Tricky Satyr, they give you cards that your opponent definitely has in their hand. And you have them in your hand as well. And actually, more so than the Gravedigger, you don't need to bounce this back multiple times. It literally is, if you're holding their card, they get shuffled back into the deck. And if they're holding duplicates, I assume the duplicates also go back in as well. So there is a potential, really big high roll of this, that, you play all this Mimicry, the Tricky Satyrs. You get a bunch of their value from their cards. You play the Shadow Cloaked Assailant, and your opponent then puts 3 or 4 cards back into the deck. That's really frightening. A bit of the issue of this card, though, is the other 2 cards, Nightmare Fuel and Ashermain, are cards that are coming from the deck, so there's no guarantee that these cards will be in their hand by the time you play the Shadow Cloaked Assailant. The other issue of this card is it's so unbelievably easy to play around. It's kind of, upsetting. Tricky Satyr, assuming it copies the lowest cost card in your opponent's hand, just play the card, then it won't ever get shuffled back into the deck. And there's a pretty good chance this is the lowest cost card. It's going to be fairly easy to have the mana to spend for it. Mimicry, you do have a little bit of, god damn it, situations where it could be a card that is really expensive and you just don't simply have the mana to play the card. And your opponent plays Shadow Cloaked Assailant and causes you to put that back into the deck. But you need to then bear in mind, in the case of Mimicry, you caused them to draw these 2 cards. It wasn't your opponent paying mana for this effect. You paid the mana for it. So even if you shuffle those 2 cards back into their deck, you paid for it. So you've effectively turned Mimicry into 1 mana, get 2 copies of cards that were in your opponent's deck, or the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. Would that have been good enough to see play in Rogue? I'm actually not sure. I don't think it would have been a strong enough payoff. You need a payoff for having all these cards from other classes that you then go on to play, other than the cards themselves, because they otherwise will just be anti-synergistic probably, and they just won't work. So that's kind of my theory of this deck right now, that it's got the potential to be really, really frustrating to play against. And actually, we'll see another package in a minute, which I think is even more frustrating to play against. But you're just playing cards for your opponent's class that have, no inherent synergy. And if Imbue is strong, you're just going to copy a bunch of Imbue cards, which don't do anything for you. So, I can't help but think there is actually no world where this deck ever is viable. I'll also say there are some other cards you could use beyond these cards, and I think this is a 5-card package, by the way. If it is true that Dark Gifts are, super strong, for example, I'm just going to use this as an example. You could put Nightmare Lord Xavius in your Rogue deck, and just play Shadow Cloaked Assailant when you have Nightmare Lord Xavius in your hand, assuming your opponent is a Dark Gift player themselves. You might just hit one of these common neutral cards that every deck runs, and cause them to shuffle them into the deck, so that's not a completely crazy scenario. What is a crazy scenario, though, is if you tech in, announce Darkness into a matchup versus Warlocks, and you turn all your Rogue cards into Warlock cards, and you play Shadow Cloaked Assailant to hopefully, generate Warlock cards that they're using, and you cause them to discard their hand. Never going to happen, by the way. It's a completely insane idea, but just imagine. Also, this thing would actually be more tempting to do if ETC was still in the game. Unfortunately, ETC is not going to be in the core set anymore, so it's actually harder to put tech cards in your deck, especially really niche tech cards. So, Announce Darkness, you've got even worse in this rotation, and you were already the worst card that was ever printed. Alright, let's look at the other legendary minion now for Rogue. Renferal the Malignant. 3 mana 3/3 beast. Battle Cry. Trap 1 random card in your opponent's hand for a turn. Improve for each time you've played this. Okay, this is giving us the theme of the other package for Rogue. The other package for Rogue is bouncing cards back and playing them over and over again. And this is the big payoff for it. Trapping a card in your opponent's hand. I don't really know fully what that actually means. It's, you know, it's one of these classic Hearthstone things where the verbiage doesn't actually make any fucking sense. You just sort of like have to assume what is happening is what you think is going to happen. I assume trap means that it's a card that can't be played, but based on trap as well, it sort of implies that I think you wouldn't be able to discard it either. Like, it just can't ever leave your hand. It's just locked into your hand. The only reason I say this, because the card immediately I thought of was Prosecutor Meltranics, which stopped your opponent playing anything but the leftmost card in their hand, which, you know, why wouldn't they just say, stop your opponent playing, like, a random card or something? Or they cannot play this random card. They very specifically used the word trap, though, which you've never used before, I think, in a Hearthstone card, so I don't know exactly what it means. We'll just say that trap means they can't play the card. That's what I'll base this on. Anyway, improve for every time you played this is the big part of this. You play this one time, it's 3 mana 3/3, trap a random card in your opponent's hand. This is worse than the effect of Prosecutor Maltranics in most scenarios. I know it's not always true. If your opponent only had 2 cards, for example, Prosecutor Maltranics did nothing, whereas Renferal would actually do something. But assuming your opponent has 4 or 5 cards in the hand, Prosecutor Maltranics would lock out 3 cards, right? Unless they could play the outside cards and then play inwards from there. Renferal, you play as 3 mana 3/3, which again is understated. So was Prosecutor Maltranics, by the way. And you lock 1 card out for a turn. It's annoying to play with, but not particularly strong, especially on a legendary minion. When you start bouncing this guy, though, you could get into, like, some really annoying situations. And obviously, Rogue is the king, I was going to say the king of swing, but the king of bounce. They are really good at bouncing around. Chumbawamba style. They have Shadow Step. They also have Waggle Pick back in the game. Again, this is rotating into the core set, which lets you bounce a friendly minion to your hand as well. It is random, so you'd have to make sure that Renferal is the only minion on the board to guarantee getting Renferal, but you could probably enable that to happen. But Shadow Step is still in the game again. Yeah, say what you want to about Shadow Step, but it's going to enable some more Rogue shenanigans for another year. What isn't in the game anymore, though, is Breakdance. Breakdance is rotating out. Nor is Bounce Around featuring Garona, which didn't really see much play, to be fair, but these 2 bounce cards have rotated out. However, there is still Youthful Brewmaster in the game as well. Actually, one of the Brewmasters also rotated out, I believe, so there are some ways to bounce cards. And actually, there is another card that we've not seen yet, which is another Rogue bounce card, so we'll have to get to that in a moment. Either way, there's like 8 or so ways for Rogue to bounce cards back. And if you bounce this card back enough times, you'll get to a situation where you play Renferal and you just lock your opponent out of their hand. Which basically means they can't respond to whatever you do on that turn, which is an extremely, extremely toxic play pattern. I'm actually shocked they've even printed a card like this, because it's going to be so unbelievably unfun for the opponent. You'll always get the card that you draw on the top of your deck, though, to play that card. They can't trap everything, unless they stop you from drawing cards as well, which don't even, like, threaten that could be a situation, but yeah, you could stop your opponent playing every card but the top deck. Basically turn them into top deck stone. And I don't think that's a very healthy play pattern. Now, I will say the weakness of this card is obviously you have to bounce it back multiple times and play it multiple times, but, you know, it's not going to stop people from doing it. It's a bit like the Snake Warlock deck again, where it wasn't good, but it's super unfun to play against. So I can see a world where this card gets asked for nerfs, even though I think it's not going to be very good, because it is super, super slow. And even at the end of the day, like, if you go through all these mana costs to, like, bounce this card back multiple times, you're really only going to have a 3/3 on the board to threaten your opponent with, unless you have some other way to mana cheat something else out with it. But yeah, I think this is a really toxic card. By the way, the other things about this, you don't only have to bounce this card. If you can copy it by other means, it would still actually work. And one of the things that Rogue can do, once they Shadow Step a 3 mana minion, is they can Sonya it. It wouldn't be a reveal season without Sonya potentially breaking the game again. Sonya, nerfed to only copy 1-cost minions. If you Shadow Step Renferal, it's a 1-cost minion. You play your Renferal with Sonya Water Dancer, you lock your opponent out of 2 cards at the minimum at that point. You get another copy of it, you play the other copy of it, you lock the rest of their hand out, and, you know, you can start bouncing both of these guys back. And either way, you've threatened 6 damage on the board that turn. So I definitely see Sonya. If Renferal is actually a real thing, Sonya will probably get into that deck as well. There's also stuff like Puppet Master Dorian, where you could get copies of this card, because you don't really care about the stat line too much on this. It's more of the battle cry. And again, the more and more you get the battle cry to go off, the painfuler and painfuler it is for your opponent. Until a point, you will hit a point where you're always just locking your entire opponent's hand out, and they're only playing top deck stone at that point. There's also other things like, discovering a minion from your deck. So Nightmare Lord Xavius, you could give this a dark gift as well to make it even more painful. Like, duplicate the battle cry would be pretty fucking annoying, and get the trapping going early. Either way, it's copying, or potentially leading to like another copy of the card, right? Raptor Herald, it's a beast. So there's not that many beasts in Rogue. There are a bunch of beasts in neutral, so it's a pretty unlikely chance you get the Raptor Herald to hit Renfrel, but if you do, womp womp, you're going to have a sad time. Anyway, I alluded to this before. There is another bounce card as well in Hearthstone. It's Web of Deception. 2 mana, return a friendly minion to your hand to summon a 4/4 spider with stealth. I actually like this card. I think this is a really, really strong card. I'm just going to compare this to Youthful Brewmaster. Youthful Brewmaster didn't see a lot of play, but whenever there's something worth bouncing back, normally something with a really good battle cry, Youthful Brewmaster sometimes dips into the meta. Web of Deception is the effect of Youthful Brewmaster, but it gives you a 4/4 stealth minion rather than just a 3/2 neutral minion. That's really strong. That's insanely strong, because your opponent is not going to be able to easily deal with the 4/4 stealth, because it's in stealth. So that means on the next turn you're going to get 4 damage, probably. So yeah, I think this is an extremely powerful spell. And I don't have a lot to say beyond that, I just think it's a really good bounce card. Obviously intended to use with Renfrel, for example. You bounce Renfrel back into your hand, and you don't just lose the 3/3 stat line, right? You get a 4/4 stat line instead of it, and then you can use Renfrel's effect going forward. So, yeah, seriously strong card. We also have Twisted Webweaver. Whenever you play, 1 mana, 1/3 beast. Whenever you play another minion you already played, draw a card. When I first saw this card, I was like, I couldn't decide if this card is really strong or really bad. I think I'm sitting somewhere in the middle right now. Whenever a card is printed that doesn't have a conditional cap to your draw engine, you always think about how to break the game. The classic card of this, by the way, is Gadgetzan's Auctioneer, which got nerfed to 7 mana eventually. I think at one point it was 4 mana, which had no cap. Every time you cast a spell, you drew a card, which obviously was insanely strong with 0 cost and 1 cost spells, because you could effectively draw through your entire deck. Twisted Webweaver is based on minions, not spells, to start with, and normally it's harder to get a 0 cost minion versus a 0 cost spell. So it's got that going for it. However, Rogue has Quasar, and Quasar can potentially reduce the cost of all cards in your deck by 3, which means you're more likely to get 0 cost minions, which could lead to a Gadgetzan Auctioneer effect. The thing that though caps this the most though, is it has to be a minion you've already played. So it isn't as easy to set up as a spell or just minion in your deck. You have to jump through some hoops to get there. So I think Twisted Webweaver is actually not that good, but it's okay. I certainly think actually in the decks where you're potentially copying a bunch of cards from your opponent, where you might get duplicates of those cards, or in this case where you're bouncing the same card back multiple times, Webweaver probably gets into those decks. But it's a pretty big downside. I will say though, if you do Quasar it and you're playing 2 copies of every card, you'll get to a point eventually where there's a decent chance you're going to be getting a duplicate of a card that you've already played during the course of the game, in which case they come with a draw card. Also worth mentioning that Twisted Webweaver though is an aura, so it has to be on the field, so you have to play this with another card. Other cards I sort of compared this to was Starving Buzzard, which was every time you summoned a beast, you drew a card. This was a 2 mana card as well, so it's actually harder to weave into plays compared to the Webweaver. But it's easy to get beasts in your hand versus minions. Also, Buzzard worked on summon, Webweaver is only on play, so you have to play the cards from hand to get the Webweaver effect. In which case, you're actually approaching stuff like Arcane Fletcher, which is a card that didn't really see any play. This required you to play 1-cost minions to draw a spell from your deck. Obviously, the pool of 1-cost minions in your deck would be very small, so you couldn't really chain off this effect multiple times. Similarly, I think Twisted Webweaver is the same. You're probably not going to chain this off many, many times. You might hit it 1 or 2 times. It's kind of my theory. Obviously, the intention of this is to play this stuff with Web of Deception and bounce cards back. You could do stuff like Nightmare Lord Xavius to discover minions from your deck, which you've already played during the course of the game, to get copies of them. Sure, that could work. One other interesting thing you could do with this card is actually run it in the Starship deck, where the X-Star can give you back copies of the starship pieces which you use to make the starship pieces. You play Twisted Web Weaver with those cards, and suddenly you're drawing a significant number of cards. So there is definitely a world where Twisted Web Weaver, if there's like any clamour for drawing Starship Rogue, could see some play. But again, it's really late. Like, it's so far down the line. You have to build the spaceship, launch the spaceship, exit out the spaceship. It's just... It's too slow to get to, like, a huge amount of value, in my opinion. But again, maybe the meta will exist like that. There's then stuff like Meadow Strider, which is cards that get shuffled back into your deck. They will work quite well with Web Weaver as well. Because you're probably going to, in your Meadow Strider deck, see many, many Meadow Striders. And every time you play a Meadow Strider, you draw another card, which maybe is another Meadow Strider. So, value, value, value. Adaptive Amalgam, you're probably going to play multiple times during the course of the game. You can drop an Adaptive Amalgam onto the board with a Twisted Web Weaver to draw a card with the Adaptive Amalgam. It's okay. It's solid okay. I'll actually say as well about the card. 1 mana 1/3 is like a very past stat line. It's okay for a 1-drop. It's not inconceivable either that you play this on turn 1 and the card lives till turn 2. In which case, if you have Web Weaver, you could play a Web Weaver on top of your Web Weaver and draw a card. So, yeah, there are some interesting things about it, but I think it's really, really, really niche. And again, I kind of alluded to this before. It won't work on things that summon from your deck, like the Illusory Greenwing. You have to play it. Summoning it doesn't count for this card. So, it's like... It just has too many heavy restrictions, I think, so I just don't see the package working with this in it, but interesting card. One final thing, and I actually don't know if this does work or not, maybe you can let me know. Does the mini count as a different minion to the maximum, what you want to call the Maxiture? Because Sandbox Scoundrel, when you generate the mini version of it, it's still called Sandbox Scoundrel. It does have mini on the card versus miniaturized, so I assume they're different cards. But if that's not the case, then maybe there is some sort of like stuff you can do with the minis, with the Twisted Web Weaver, to get the minis to draw you cards as well. Possibly, and that sets up a combo. But I don't think that will actually work. But let me know if you think it does work, or if you know it doesn't, or whatever. One final thing I'll mention as well is Joymancer Geppetto could generate you a bunch of copies of cards that you play during the course of this game. Unfortunately for Rogue, I just don't see any real way of abusing this. You would get a Twisted Web Weaver back, funnily enough, with Joymancer Geppetto, because it is a 1-attacker minion. But the packages that exist in Rogue right now just don't really have a lot of 1-attack or 1-health minions across the board, so I just don't see any, like, upside to doing this. But watch this space. If there is, like, a 1-health or a 1-attack package in Rogue, Joymancer Geppetto plus Twisted Web Weaver could do some interesting things. Finally, we get to Harbinger of the Blighted. 2 mana 2/3 minion. Whenever this enters your hand from the battlefield, summon 2 random 2-cost minions. Okay, this is really interesting. There's never been a card printed like this before. There's nothing to peg it to. There's only ever, like, in the past, been value from bouncing cards based on the battle cry, really, of the card, or some sort of effect from playing the card again. There's never been a card printed which was, during the course of the card bouncing back to your hand, an effect goes off. This is the first example of it. It is a really potentially strong example of it, though. And I say this because of the mana cost, basically. A 2 mana 2/3 obviously is understated. It's not good enough to see any play in Standard. You need to bounce this card. However, what is the classical Rogue bounce card? It's Shadow Step. And Shadow Step makes minions cost 2 less to get bounced back. So if you ever have a scenario where you have Harbinger of the Blighted and 2 Shadow Steps in your hand, you've won the game. Because all you do is on turn 2, and especially if you have the coin, I would coin this on 1 if I could do it, but on 2, play Harbinger of the Blighted, Shadow Step it, play it again, Shadow Step it, play it again. You then have 4 random 2-cost minions on the board and a 2/3 on the board on turn 2. And most decks can't deal with that. So there is some low rolling involved in the 2-cost minion pool. I should probably have done an average stat line. I suspect it's about 2/2, but either way, you've probably cheated about 10 stat lines out on turn 2 for a 3-card combo. Also, especially if you can do this with a coin on turn 1, just, bottom right, push the button. It will just be over. Like, there is a potentially insanely high roll in this card. Other than that, though, it's actually not that bad. It's really just that high roll example, which is pretty bad. Otherwise, it's paying 2 mana to summon 2 random 2-cost minions that strong for Standard. It's not bad, right? If you could do that on 2, then yeah, fine. But by the time you even get to 3, is that worth it? And also, I'm bearing in mind on this card, it's a 2-card combo to get that, so it's actually worse than just a 3 mana card, summon 2 random 2-cost minions. I don't think that would see play, so it's an interesting card, an interesting idea of a mechanic, but other than an insane high roll, I think the card is kind of garbage. Anyway, this is the other package. It's really not big enough to really focus around a deck on its own. It really feels like it has to work with some other package out there. Like, you'll just plug it into some other thing to help that other deck along. I don't think Renifral is a big enough draw to actually win the game just with Renifral, and these other 3 cards. But Rogue has a lot of packages out there. Maybe you put this into your copy opponent cards package, and you just have these additional cards out there, because you might sometimes hit multiple copies of an opponent's card, in which case Twisted Weave would work with that, or you'll generate a card that's worth bouncing back with Web of Deception, and that's fine. You might just strike lucky, right? Maybe you play this in your Dark Gift deck as well. Sure, maybe. We've seen some reasons why that could work. You might be able to generate a discovered card, which is a copy of the card you played during the course of the game, which would work with Web Weaver, and it might have a nice Dark Gift on it as well. Maybe the combo deck works. Rogue put a combo deck out there, right? It's seen no play, but maybe this is what it needs. It needs a bunch of cheap bouncing cards to make the combo deck pop as well. And then finally, there is still the Templar deck as well, which is seeing a bit of play right now. They've got pretty good battle cries. If you start bouncing these guys back and, getting card draw with it, maybe that would work as well. But my gut is telling me it's a whole load of